Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we're joined by Aiyana Reissman to talk about burrowing owls. Aiyana joined us a few weeks ago to talk about light-footed ridgeways rails. She's the animal care manager at the Living Coast Discovery Center in San Diego, California, where she oversees the care for over 25 species of rescued birds native to the area. She works with a lot of burrowing owls, so we have a lot of fun talking about these amazing birds with her. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Well, welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ, and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda, and we have Aiyana Reissman joining us again from Living Coast Discovery Center. Aiyana joined us a few weeks ago to talk about the light-footed ridgeways rail, and she's back to talk with all of us, so we're going to talk about the burrowing owl this week. So welcome back, Aiyana, and nice to see everyone.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Good to see you.
So burrowing owl, I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, this is one of everyone's favorites when they visit the center for sure. They are so cute.
So they're tiny, right? They're one of the smallest owls.
Yeah.
They're on the smaller side.
Yeah, definitely on the smaller side. The ones that we see here, I mean, they're found throughout South America and North America and the southern part of Canada. The ones we see in our populations here and the ones that I've worked with usually trend around 130 to 160 grams. So definitely on the smaller side for most of them. They're less than a foot tall, very small in stature, but still adorable. Probably one of the cuter ones.
Yeah.
So they're like the size of a robin almost then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe so. So I think they have, I believe, a little bit of a lighter frame. And I don't think there's much dimorphism between males and females. We're typically seeing about the same size, but I know females will usually be a little bit heavier as an egg-bearing species. We'll typically see that sort of trend. But I know males definitely like to display a little bit more, so oftentimes they can look a little bit bigger and bulkier, where the females try and kind of stay a little bit more flush and streamlined with their feathers. But you will see them fluctuate their feathers a lot, which makes them look bigger or smaller at different times. So sometimes if they're alarming from a high perch or on a tree, they'll be a little bit more streamlined and try and stand up nice and tall. Other times, if they're on the ground by a burrow, you'll oftentimes see them puffing up a little bit more to seem bigger and scarier on the ground, which is an interesting kind of change for how they're responding to things in their environment.
So I love words. So I always have to look up and see if I can figure out what words mean. In our database, which has old taxonomy, it's under the genus Spiotyto. As a monotypic genus. So if you're looking on our website to see, actually, it wasn't even working last week, so who knows what people are doing. But it's now under Athene, the Greek goddess of wisdom, which I thought was really, which was a great, because if you look at owls with those big eyes, right, and these things have piercing yellow, bright yellow eyes, and its species name is Canicularia, which is Latin for borrower or miner, which I also think is kind of hilariously reflective of its behavior, its natural history behavior. So there's my words for the day.
Yep, and these guys are, they're terrestrial. They're nesting in holes in the ground and or nest boxes more and more as people are trying to help the populations. They were historically associated in the upper Midwest with prairie dog towns. And as a result, they've become a conservation concern in a lot of areas because habitat has been changed to agriculture or residential areas. And as that happens, or you get rid of the prairie dogs, I think it's one of the interesting things about them is it's not so much unavailability of prey as it is actually suitable places to have a burrow, to be able to nest.
So why do you think they actually build their own burrows in Florida, which they don't do in the western parts of its distributions, but they do there? Why is that, John?
No idea. I was actually wondering about that too, because again, it's because historically they literally didn't have to in the upper Midwest. What do you think they do in California?
We see them mainly monopolizing different types of ground squirrel burrows. That's their preferred habitat, or whatever burrows, maybe rabbits and things like that too. Um, the habitat crossover is more common with ground squirrels out here. It could also be due to I don't know if it's maybe related to the soil content or how difficult it is. The soil out here in San Diego, I wouldn't call it soil. It's pretty tough dirt to try and get through. We have one burrowing owl in our collection that I've ever even seen attempt to start to dig or anything like that. Granted, we are providing them with burrows or nest boxes or things like that. But just in terms of enrichment or habitat, yeah, only one that's ever even considered digging down into the ground or anything. So I think it could be related to availability, but also just how easy or difficult it might be to build their own.
Yeah. Aiyana, I was looking at your partners, the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. I was looking at their website, and they said exactly what you said, that in Florida, if the ground is soft or sandy, particularly in Florida, they dig the tunnels themselves.
Yeah.
So it is, like you said, it's just like if the ground's amenable to it, they'll do it there.
Yeah.
But, one of the things that's really interesting about them too, which is unique among owls, I think, is that they'll literally tolerate really high densities of individual burrowing owls in the area as long as the food's there and the burrows are there. And so you end up with essentially burrowing owl colonies in a situation where in all other species of owls, they'd be off defending individual territories that would include feeding territories too.
Yeah. You'll definitely see a bit of territoriality between nesting pairs in certain areas. But you'll also sometimes see these extra pair copulations between males who are tending to several different females with their eggs and with their burrows. So they have a fascinating social dynamic and hierarchy. And it does seem to really vary just depending on resource availability and habitat availability. And it also varies from season to season, but you'll definitely start to see some of that territoriality start to play out depending on the age and survival rates from previous seasons too. But I think that also is a good testament to the wide variety of sounds that they make. When you start to see these more social species pop up, they're going to need to communicate in some way. And I think burrowing owls are one of those owls that just have this huge array of sounds that they make. And that's one of the coolest parts about working with them, is you can tell so much about how they're feeling about a particular thing in their environment, or the different people that they like and who they talk to and things like that. So it is really fascinating to see some of those social dynamics play out, not just within the species, but as they're engaging with other species around them.
Oh, that's so cute.
I read a hilarious account of the bill clacking that they do, and that they often injure their tongue while they're doing it. So, I mean, I don't know what contribution the tongue makes, if it's just an accidental byproduct of clacking your bill, or if they're actually somehow making sounds with their bill, but it was pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
Which I guess is not so hilarious, but it just struck me as really funny.
It's silly, I think, is the only way I can describe it, because it's, as an animal care provider, you don't want them to injure themselves, but they do it consistently. When we had our first clutch of burrowing owls in the breeding program, we would periodically take them out for West Nile virus vaccinations and weights and measurements and things along those lines. And almost without fail, every time we would handle them, at least more than half of the group would clack their beaks and bite their tongues to the point where they were drawing blood. And it would be really concerning for us. But the more we talk to partners, it's very common for the species. So something about that beak clacking, I don't know if maybe they have a less sensitive tongue, or it's, like you said, not as vital in whatever they would use it for in the past, but it's something that has become pretty consistent with them. The little coos that they have are very cute too. So we'll oftentimes see that one of our burrowing owls in particular, when he is in different spaces, he'll respond differently to the people as we're working with him. So when he's in his outside habitat, he will kind of screech and hiss and make a lot more of his territorial sounds when you're outside of his habitat. And then as soon as you walk in, he'll give you a couple hoo-hoos and say hello. And when he is inside, he's an older bird. And so in wintertime, he actually has an indoor holding to help keep him a little bit warmer. And when he's in there, he just consistently hoots at anyone and everything that comes by. And he's like this sweet little angel, but he has a very different personality when he's in his outdoor exhibit.
Oh,
Anybody who's had a cat is well aware of behavior like that.
Yes. All sorts of different personalities come up.
So I had a question about the burrowing owls. When they're burrowing, do they share their burrows with other animals then? Or is it just they find one that's like abandoned and they take it over and then that's for burrowing owls after that?
So I think for the most part, they take over abandoned burrows.
Okay.
But, the interesting thing there is because of the nature of those colonies, you can get all kinds of weird things happening.
Like what?
Just over time with associations with other animals and things. Just, I think because the opportunities are there. If a burrowing owl has a nest hole and there's a arm off it and there's something else that comes in and tries to get in it, as long as it'll tolerate the burrowing owl nest, they're probably good with it.
They got tons of parasites in their nest too, probably because they do that. But that was another thing that I read. It's like, holy cow. So you have to, tolerate a lot of fleas and mites and flies and all kinds of crap on you if you're a burrowing owl, especially in Florida. It doesn't get cold enough to kill anything. So, it's like, it is what it is.
Yeah, they remind me a little bit of gremlins when it comes to owls, I guess. They have all of these little warbles and sounds and quacks and crazy little things that they make, but then they're also kind of living in filth, so to speak, when it comes to these burrows. And when they are finding these abandoned burrows, that's when they'll have this other array of sounds in terms of mimicking rattlesnakes or hissing. And that's a really cool aspect too. So they will try and protect their burrows from other things coming in. Those are to defend against ground squirrels or rabbits trying to reclaim a burrow or something along those lines. So they definitely have a good ability to protect certain spaces if they need to. But I think that also is going to be dependent, kind of what you were saying in terms of what they'll tolerate sharing that space. But on the topic of gross stuff, yeah, they will oftentimes head out into spaces to collect manure from different areas. So in San Diego, it's really common to see them in places where cattle is used to graze. And so they'll head out and collect cow patties and line their burrows with them. And it's kind of twofold in terms of benefits for them. They're able to attract bugs, which they love to eat. Bugs are probably one of their favorite foods. But it also helps ward off against other predators. No one else really tolerates poop all over their homes and habitats and where they sleep in the way that burrowing owls do. So they're adorable, but they're kind of gross.
Yeah, I'm not trying that.
Yeah, me neither.
It would probably keep people away though.
There are other birds that do that. And so, you got to do what works.
Yeah.
And I love the fact, like you're saying, that it'll actually attract prey items too. So it's a win-win situation for them.
Well, we could go back to their cuteness, because if you look at videos of them or if you see them in the wild, they bob up and down, which is actually also adorable. So I'll think of them like that, not dusting their opening with poop.
Yeah, the bobbing up and down is so cute and often comes with that territorial display too. So it's kind of tough to take them seriously where they're bouncing and making these cute sounds to try and tell you to stay away.
So they're endangered in western parts of Canada, at least. So they went from threatened, a little bit threatened, a lot threatened, to endangered, which is not true of a lot of the U.S. range. So I don't know if there were more precipitous declines or populations were never as great in the western part of Canada. Do you know?
I'd say they probably weren't very great. I mean, one thing about this bird is they have a huge distribution when it comes right down to it. In other words, the same taxon at the species level is occurring all the way from Canada down into southern South America. And so they've clearly figured stuff out to be successful. And I think that may mean getting into certain areas in small numbers, in which case, humans show up and change the habitat a little bit, and suddenly you're pushed to the edge in some ways. So for instance, in the West Indies, they've disappeared from a number of the islands that they used to be on.
Well, they also have 25 subspecies named, which is absolute lunacy, and probably more of a reflection of the fact that what they didn't know at the beginning of naming all these things is that plumage wear causes tremendous variation in the color that a bird might have. And so if you go somewhere and you collect all of your samples to study in May, you're going to have a very different perspective than if you collected them in October, which I didn't really know much about, but that's certainly a complicating factor because there's almost no species for which we have enough samples from throughout a year to understand the annual cycle of any of these things. So you can really get led down some interesting pathways.
But they do some interesting things in South America, like they get up into the Andes. And so my guess is that some of those populations now that are suddenly nesting at much higher elevations are probably under some interesting selection pressures that are different than the ones in San Diego or the Midwest or Canada. And that there's been some genetic work to look at the population structure. And for the most part, particularly in North America, there's actually not much genetic structure. And that may be sort of the result of their ability to take advantage of habitat as it becomes available. So if you think about it, in the Midwest, they would have basically been out of habitat for the Pleistocene as the glaciations covered the Midwest, but clearly expanded successfully into that area once they receded. And so, they're migratory. And so they show up, for instance, they show up occasionally at Montrose and make all the birders happy in Chicago. So they're definitely capable of getting around.
I didn't realize that they have been seen on Montrose, John. That's awesome. So you can see them around here.
Yep. But Shannon, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure we do not have a specimen from Illinois.
I didn't even think we would have one, so I didn't look. We have 381 specimens, though, so we have a lot in our collections, over the last 130 years.
Well, I'm pretty sure we don't, and that was because some of the birders were talking about the question: if one shows up in Illinois, is it from the Florida population or is it from the Western population? And again, as Shannon was saying, because of the morphological variation in these things, I am not sure you could necessarily figure that out with a specimen from a just plumage standpoint, but you might be able to do it from a genetic standpoint, or at least come pretty close. And I don't think we have the samples to do it yet.
Our website's not working. Have to go to GBIF or VertNet. Don't ask me why.
John, like RJ, I was really interested that they would come up to Montrose. Something we were talking about earlier is they're terrestrial. And I wondered, how much do they fly if they're doing most of what they do on the ground?
Depends on the time of year. So during the breeding season, as Aiyana was saying, is that they can, they're staying pretty close to their burrows sometimes because as long as there's prey there, they don't have to go very far. They might go a kilometer or two to hunt and then come back. But the crazy thing is that in the non-breeding season, when it gets cold in some of those habitats like central Canada, they're pulling out and going down to southern Texas and northern Mexico to spend the winter.
Aiyana, I was going to ask, how are the numbers near you as far as burrowing owls? Are they health, or is it a healthy population down there, or?
Yeah, they're listed as a species of concern in many areas down here, and we do have recovery plans and recovery programs in place to help boost the populations. Over the last few years, we are seeing fairly good numbers from the impacts of the propagation program, which is excellent. Um, but it is something that still kind of continuously needs to be monitored. One of the big impacts for our program was actually the highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. Once that made its way to California, we had to take a really close look at our care for all of our birds and the efficacy and whether or not it was appropriate to continue breeding and propagating birds to release out into the wild. So for the last few years, it's actually been on pause as we're all starting to just get a handle on that, where certain areas are deemed not as necessary to, or for propagation, or certain populations aren't as in need of that. That's another part of the conversation now in terms of whether or not we want to allocate resources for breeding and release, or whether or not we want to focus a bit more on surveying and understanding what's going on with the wild population. So much like the rail program, the burrowing owl program, which is actually fully managed by the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, that program is going to have a multi-pronged approach, and that includes propagation, surveying, and monitoring, providing different types of burrows and habitats for the wild population. In some cases, different types of proving pens for them to give them a good head start before they're fully fledged out into the wild. So there's definitely a lot of strong efforts to keep them around, and there are a lot of protections in place for them when it comes to development. That's one of the huge areas of focus when it comes to cross collaboration with different entities outside of the conservation world. So making sure that whenever they are spotted, that's documented, and there's an informed decision made as to whether or not construction can move forward, or if something needs to be relocated, or adjustments might need to be made further.
What was the distribution of HPAI for your birds? Is it every year now? Do you see it, or is it just once and you're just waiting to see if it has an outbreak status? And how many species are you seeing it in?
It's something we monitored a little bit more closely when it first hit, and we kind of all stay in close communication. Basically, have different trigger points. So when there's an outbreak within 200 miles of our center, then we have certain precautions that go in place. When there's an outbreak within 100 miles of our center, we have additional protocols that will go in place. So we kind of continually monitor that. On the refuge, we mainly saw it in some of the larger migratory shorebirds, so seagulls and black-necked stilts, and raptors. These were all presumed at the height of the outbreak here. Most of our centers were just too inundated to even receive species for testing at that point. So when we saw signs of birds that may be sick on the refuge, it was something that we just noted and reported. Most of the cases we see now are with poultry. So small farms, large farms. We're not seeing it quite as much in terms of the wild populations here, which is great because we have a fully open system with all of our animals. So being on a wildlife refuge, it's fantastic because we can see all of these wild birds that are here. But it also meant during that time where the outbreaks were first occurring, we were terrified for our birds. It was really difficult to try and isolate or prevent any type of exposure without jeopardizing their quality of life. So we had to be really innovative in terms of the ways that we were caring for them, and it required a lot of resources, which is something that all zoos and aquariums or anyone that's caring for birds now has to factor in. So there's just a lot of big changes that came over the last few years, and it's still something that we're learning from a lot of our counterparts about, especially in Europe, where they've been seeing this for many years. We saw it the first season not only move east to west towards California, but then we also saw it moving from north to south. So we saw 2 waves that came at different times of year, and just the impacts from all of that too. But fortunately, we never saw any sickness within any of the birds from our flock, which is great.
Yeah, I think this example is really highlighting kind of a terrifying thing and a good thing at the same time. In other words, at least the networks are available to give people the heads up that there's been a virus detected in a given region, and people can start doing what they can to hopefully prevent it from getting into a given population. But this is a good thing that we actually have the capacity to know when it's literally happening these days.
It takes a lot of coordination, though, amongst entities that often don't talk to each other very much, except at national meetings once a year. So that's a really complicated thing, too, is how do you spread best practices? Who has them? Do you do research on them? How do you know?
Yeah, we just got done with a listening session for the Biodiversity Collections Network that included a listening session on One Health initiatives, which is basically the idea is that you're combining the human health community with the natural world community to do a better job of sharing data for effectively combating this. And of course, one of the interesting challenges is the place people are most worried about is it getting into human populations. That's priority one. But for people like us, I mean, we want to keep it from decimating the biodiversity around us too. And so, there's some possibilities here with respect to data exchange and communication that I think can make that it's already starting to make a big difference. But it really is amazing how many different kinds of players there are out there in terms of keeping track of all this stuff, or trying to at least.
People think that the big fear is it's going to go from an animal into a human, and okay, that is a problem, right? But the problem is that humans move everywhere. So humans are the ones that are taking these things all over the place and dropping them off, including in their own pets. I mean, COVID taught us this, that many, many cats and dogs died because they got COVID from their pet. And, it's not just a one-way path from the bad wildlife to the good humans. It's not that easy. And humans are one species. They ought to remember that. Tens of millions, if not billions, on Earth, and one should not dominate.
So the last version of bird flu, 10, 15 years ago that came through, people were talking about migratory birds carrying it, and they were worried about places like Africa and how it would spread in Africa. And the first place it showed up in Africa was in Nigeria. And while that's not off migratory pathways, it was surprising given that this had started in Asia. And it almost certainly got to Nigeria in chickens that people were moving around. Mm-hmm. So there's not only humans moving around, there's humans moving their poultry and things like that around that can spread some of these viruses faster than even the migratory birds can.
Yeah.
Although this time around, as Aiyana was mentioning, bird flu is really prevalent in migratory shorebirds. And so we were hearing from colleagues that work in places like the Falkland Islands and Antarctica that they were expecting it to show up there and have a real problem with things like penguin colonies. And that's actually happened. And that's not coming from humans because there just aren't that many humans coming down there. It's literally natural movement of birds that are carrying these viruses all over the planet. So it can work both ways. It's just we now actually understand that in ways that we never did before.
Yeah, when that first started happening, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, people would come to us and say, "Aren't you worried?" And I said, "I'm way more worried about O'Hare Airport right now than because that's where all of the things that are being imported, they're all coming into O'Hare Airport. So if they're really communicable, we are going to be a center of spread out, but not because of migratory waterfowl or shorebirds, which there's admittedly these things in them, but because of human practices of moving taxa all over the world to big population centers, which give these things opportunities to to go into new hosts and to move. So, people were like, what? I'm like, yeah, I'm way more worried about chickens at O'Hare or smuggled parrots at O'Hare or all these goofy things that people do.
And at the same time, you could imagine, burrowing owls are an interesting taxon because they are actually associated on a fairly regular basis with things like cattle and other organisms that are closely tied to the human food chain. And so those are really common interactions that can allow for diseases to spread various directions too. And again, we're just now getting to understand that we could set up a network of surveillance that can begin to really, hopefully, provide some better information earlier, like Aiyana's talking about with respect to what they heard about in Southern California. And that requires a lot of effort from government agencies to interact with one another, which isn't necessarily a strong point sometimes.
Burrowing owls were my introduction to the issue of outdoor cats, which I'd never thought about. So like we were still in graduate school 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. The campus at Florida International University, their campus nickname is the Owls. Their sports nickname is the Owls, but Florida Atlantic, I guess. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were declining. There was a proposal to capture the cats. The cats had been killing the burrowing owls on campus. And there was a really strong program that was being put in place to capture the cats and take them away from the campus. And that caused a tremendous amount of publicity, negative publicity for the school, associated with moving the poor cats. And I think that cats won. I think that some of the trapping programs were halted because it was so visible on the campus. Animal rights groups started protesting on the campus. It was a really big thing. And I don't know where it stands now, but the idea that we would find it okay for an introduced taxon, house cats, to wipe out a native population of one of the most adorable birds is absolute craziness. People are crazy about this cat thing, which I know we'll probably get some not so nice feedback from us about that. But the cats are a huge problem.
My recollection is, Aiyana, you were talking about that with the light-footed rails, right?
Yeah. Introduced predators are one of the biggest issues for a lot of birds, but in particular smaller birds. So anything from your hummingbirds to your songbirds, but also a lot of the birds that we can find on the ground. House cats obviously can't fly, and that's one advantage that most blighted birds have. But when you have a bird like the Ridgway's rail, which tries to hide in brush, and you have a bird like the burrowing owl, who tries to hide on the ground or in a burrow, both of those are going to be much more susceptible to house cats, which are also another terrestrial predator. They have a huge impact on populations where it's not managed, and that management can be highly controversial. It is really important to think long term with a lot of these programs. So doing the bare minimum of a spay and neuter program where that generation might still be in a population is one aspect. Removal in some areas is also going to be another necessary requirement for safeguarding certain species in these different areas. So it is a highly controversial space, and it's not really fair for humans to be the judge on what stays and what goes. But when we're the problem in terms of the introduction of those non-native and invasive species, then we're responsible for figuring out an outcome for what should have been there in the first place. So it is tough, but I'm definitely of the camp where the native species and the native populations take precedence, and especially when they're going to be those endangered, threatened, vulnerable species of concern, you have to look at it in that sort of longevity of the diversity of an ecosystem.
There was also a really substantial problem associated with Google's campus, and the burrowing owls declining around Google's campus, and that's because these well-intentioned people started feeding on the campus. They started feeding the cats, so the cat population went way up. The cats go out of the Google campus and into the surrounding neighborhoods, and there go the burrowing owls. So you know, and I know most people don't think the next step beyond what they're doing, but yeah, you just never know exactly what you're unleashing when you start to do things.
Yeah, it's a very old school method of ecology where you're putting something in to just see what happens, or introducing things. We've learned pretty quickly, relative on a human scale, quickly, that that's not a good idea because we don't know the full fallout of something like that. But cats is a really good. It's an ironic introduction because oftentimes they're brought in to take care of a rodent problem. But owls are way more efficient when it comes to eliminating rodents in an area. So when you have something like a barn owl, let's say, a barn owl clears, I think, something absurd like 1,000 to 3,000 mice per year, and that's one single barn owl.
God.
So when you have an animal that's that well adapted to removing vermin, quote unquote, in a space, but you're introducing other predators that are then targeting those, that you're creating a huge issue, and it disrupts the ecosystem on a greater scale than those rats or mice or anything along those lines. So it is just a little bit ironic that
I'm
cats
all
are
for
introduced
introducing barn owls.
Yeah.
I can get behind barn owls.
Yeah, I think, John, you were mentioning the use of owl boxes to promote populations of burrowing owls, but that's something that's used to promote populations of owls all over a lot of different things. I mean, you'll end up with your mourning doves in some of those boxes too, but providing those spaces and habitats in urban areas is a great way to solve a problem of not having enough space or adequate nesting features for wildlife, but also making sure that you can take care of this problem of rats and mice and other creepy crawlies that you don't want to have around. That is something that's a very eco-friendly solution and going to positively contribute to a lot of the populations that we work to help.
You know, there's all these new efforts on planned communities and how to make cities, towns, neighborhoods different, more walkable, more livable, more healthy for people. And there's a lot of wealthy tech people who are doing that. And sometimes I roll my eyes at them, but, you know, some good could come out of it. But I wonder what kind of protections they're building into these planned communities for wildlife. Do you know, do you ever get involved in things like that?
It's not super common down here, to my knowledge. It would definitely be something I'd have to look into a little bit more. I think in all of my time working with birds down here, I've been invited to one event where I brought one of our ambassador barn owls, and it was a workshop to build boxes, or to essentially learn how to build boxes. So there are definitely organizations and businesses that are founded around that. And there are certain apartment complexes and businesses in the area that have moved to a more eco-friendly response, mainly because a lot of realization has come surrounding the use of rodenticides or different types of poisons in an area, because those have a trickle-up effect where they're directly impacting pets in some cases, whether it's dogs or cats that may inadvertently eat a rat or mouse that has ingested something. It impacts reptiles if reptiles are eating rats and mice. And it greatly impacts owls that are out hunting for those rats and mice. It's not going to be an instant effect when it comes to a rodenticide. So those can stay present in an ecosystem for enough time to impact some of those predators. So upon realizing that, I think a lot of places have started to shift to using something that's not going to cause fallout in that way, because you're responsible for the death of someone's pet, then that's going to make a lot more noise than if you're responsible for a barn owl that someone may not have as much attachment to. So at least cats are helping out in that way. They can highlight that aspect when you have an angry pet parent.
Maybe the big tech could fix their algorithm so it prioritizes bird videos instead of cute cat videos. I feel like there's too many popular cat videos
That's an interesting idea.
I agree.
RJ.
That's a great idea.
Show them a burrowing owl.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Who do you talk to about that? Do you know
I don't
Eric Schmidt?
Elon. Yeah.
I don't have an in into those places.
Yeah. Yeah, if
I
any
would,
of our listeners
I would love to
hook
see
us
that
up.
experiment.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'd like to be able to tweak my own, and I know that puts people in silos more, but I want to tweak my own algorithms for what Google shows me, not be as trapped necessarily by some of these other things. I mean, that's a distant dream, I suppose.
So you can watch more burrowing owl videos?
Yeah.
Yeah, they are pretty cute.
See, again, though, I think RJ's right, though. I think we got to figure out a way to get developers to watch burrowing owl videos.
Yeah. That's a start.
We had cameras installed in our burrows for the breeding program, and I can tell you, the moment if you're watching a camera, well, I mean, they have them all over the place, right? Where you can watch different birds. What is it? The Cornell Labs that has different bird cameras all over the world that you can track and follow. But we had some in our burrows, and every single day, the entire team would be surrounded around the computer screen, just waiting to see when the eggs would hatch and when we would start to see babies. So I think that point of advocacy, being able to either live stream or just share those little snippets where you have these miraculous moments of baby burrowing owls coming into the world, that's definitely a good way to highlight some of the conservation, but I think also change some of those algorithms, right? I think it'll only be thank you very many videos to go down a rabbit hole of wanting to see all the cute little burrowing owls. I think watching them run is one of the funniest things. They just have, I always like to see it with all birds, but I call it lifting their skirts. So they kind of lift up all of their lower feathers so that their legs are more exposed, and they will just sprint across the ground. And we'll see it with quite a few of our birds working with rescues. Many of them are non-flighted with different types of wing amputations. So they spend much more time on the ground. And watching an animal like a bald eagle run around, they look like silly little dinosaurs. It's amazing to watch, but also just something that kind of builds that empathy and that relation that we have to them. It's very different watching an animal fly. We have no true concept of that, but watching them walk around, we can relate to that. We can understand that. And I think there's a little bit of comedy in that too, which is fun.
Yeah, that should be way more popular than Grumpy Cat or whatever.
Or that don't mess with cats thing that everybody watched at the beginning.
Oh.
I'm using the non-swear word part of that.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
I want don't mess with burrowing owls.
Yeah, there we go.
That's the next
Going
one.
after people who are not taking care of their cats, for example. Hunting them down with Google Images.
See, that's the crazy thing to me about those cats is they really don't belong to anybody. So it's not their cats, except that they put food out for them. And I think that's what kind of lessens the impact of you don't have the responsibility of ownership. It's not your cat necessarily. It's just the colony of cats that you're actually feeding out there. And as Aiyana's saying, I mean, I love the point about, you're basically controlling rodent density with owls. That's what owls have always done.
I think that's
an important argument.
Yeah, that's one of the struggles with conservation in general. With dogs and cats, they're tangible. That's something that you can touch, you can cuddle. They bring an additional level of joy to our lives as people because of that sort of interaction. And with wildlife, there's such that can never be achieved and shouldn't ever be achieved, honestly. But it definitely becomes more difficult because you can't build that same level of empathy. You have to somehow be able to educate in a way that people understand, even though they're not bringing that same connectivity. It's still such an important aspect, and being able to get out into nature and into a space and enjoy them in a safe way for both people and for animals. That's going to be a huge part of it. And I think local conservation is one of the most important, or kind of highlighting aspects for that. When you're able to focus on the native wildlife in an area, you can build that sort of connection. It's really difficult for anyone to build a connection with an animal like a polar bear. They're beautiful, they're magnificent, but very few people in the world are ever going to be able to see that in person or experience that. Without zoos and aquariums, most would never be able to see them at all. And when you have different societies that are able to get people out into nature and see these birds up close, so being able to go and spot a burrowing owl in its natural habitat, or spot a ridgway's rail in its natural habitat, though that's the closest we can get to building that sort of empathy and that connection. And that's essential when it comes to conservation. You have to convince people to care about them.
And that's where I think burrowing owls actually have, unfortunately, a lot more charisma than ridgway's whale.
Mm-hmm.
Or California gnatcatcher, for instance.
I would disagree, but that's just my opinion.
I think everybody would.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
I would say they have more charisma than a bald eagle, frankly.
Oh,
I know those are fighting words.
Wait,
but
Canadian.
I think burrowing owls making the case for the Final Four next year.
Yep, I was just gonna say
Oh,
it
yeah,
sounds like
yeah.
there's some arguments being made already.
Yeah. Well, Aiyana, this has been great. I think we're getting close on time, unfortunately. Is there anything else burrowing owl related we want to chat about?
I want
John
to
Shannon?
ask, they're missing a secondary. Why?
A secondary, I'm not sure what that
Why
means.
not?
One of the wing feathers. So you have primaries and then you have secondaries.
Oh.
And they've evolved to have one fewer. Why?
Because it makes them better at running around on the ground.
No.
Are there any, I don't know too much about the comparative anatomy, but are there any other birds that are predominantly on the ground that lack secondaries in that way?
I mean, there's a lot of loss, and in different parts of the wing, the way the wings are numbered, it's really confusing to me. It doesn't matter how old I get. I still can never remember how and why you number them in the way you do. But they don't always lose the same feather across evolutionary history of birds. But this one is missing, I think it's between 4 and 5. So they only have 9 secondaries instead of 10. And I didn't know that until recently, and I don't know why.
Hmm.
So what we really need is a better fossil record, because there's actually there's fossil evidence of a ground-dwelling owl in the West Indies that went extinct back in the Pleistocene, and so there's the question: is like, how many secondaries does that have? I could be right about my idea about ground-dwelling.
You could be. You can make any speculation you want in the absence of data. That's a good thing about being a scientist too. Just don't get data to disprove your random wacko kinds of ideas. So there's my
I
random
heard
way
John's
to...
wacko idea and I bought it.
Yeah, well, conspiracy theories and gaslighting can be important forms of communication these days, can't they? But anyway, so that's my random way of figuring that there's like all these really weird things. Every species has some kind of weird aspect of it that we don't know and might never know.
Well, I think before we wrap it up, Aiyana, did you want to tell us a little bit about the internship program at Living Coast?
Yeah.
We didn't know about it when we talked before, and it'd be great to highlight an awesome program like that and just give it a little bit of spotlight if you do want to talk about it.
Absolutely. So the Living Coast has a pretty robust volunteer program. We have fantastic partnerships with a lot of the local elementary schools, but also a lot of the local high schools. So it's a graduation requirement for students to volunteer at various organizations. And one of the great things about the Living Coast, we're pretty small, we're a small team, and we are able to provide a very hands-on internship in both our marine and reptile departments, as well as our avian and mammal department. So it provides students in both high school, college, actually pretty much whenever they're interested. It's a 12 to 14 week program where they're learning about the care of rescued wildlife and the species that we have here in San Diego and throughout California. It allows them to get a glimpse of some of the medical care that we provide, of course, all of the daily husbandry in terms of cleaning habitats and exhibits and things like that. A great opportunity to learn a little bit more about nutrition and diet prep and what kind of just goes into caring for species long term. And one of the things that's unique about the Living Coast is that we're working with a lot of rescued wildlife and a population that has been around for a long time. So some of our birds have been with us since, I think the oldest is 1997. So being able to understand how care changes throughout life stages is a really important aspect, and how to make adjustments for different types of wildlife as they've had certain surgeries or medical changes that can create different types of issues for them. So it's a fantastic program, and we really do our best to work with a lot of people locally and provide access to an opportunity that is sometimes a little bit prohibited or difficult to get a foot in the door, so to speak. So we make sure to provide a space where it's a little bit more accessible for groups and minorities that might struggle to gain access or get a foot in the door in a lot of these opportunities. So making sure that we're working locally with community colleges and universities, but also making sure that we're providing access to the local high schools and creating awareness for the opportunities that are out there. That's something that's really important to us, and something that's easy for us to do, just paying attention to what the community's needs are, listening to that, and responding accordingly.
That's transformative for people, right? I mean, they get to see these things close up, just like you can watch the transformation that come over people when you bring them behind the scenes of the museum and they understand what goes on. You can watch it in a little kid's face when you let them touch an owl and see kind of up close what an owl is made up of. You can't go back from that. Yeah, well, but live owls too. They don't touch them, but we've had someone who works on staff at the museum who does have a rehab permit and has she doesn't have them anymore, but she did have 2 birds that were part of an educational program that she used to bring them all over the place. And you just could watch people, you could just see it in their face, seeing something up close that they never really thought they could ever do, what it can do. I mean, those are things you don't forget. And an internship like that is stuff you don't forget.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Every single person on the animal care team is actually now a graduate of the internship program. So that turnaround is fantastic to see. It's something that I actually started at the Living Coast in the volunteer program specialist role, and really fleshed out this program to build it to a level that is something that's not just bringing in volunteers to benefit the center, but creating something that is truly educating and contributing to someone's long-term experience and development professionally. That's one of the key aspects. So it is great for us and the team as well, because I think one of the huge marks of understanding something is being able to teach it to someone else. And that's our way of saying, okay, if you're not quite understanding something, how can we modify things to make sure there's a better understanding of it? Creating awareness around different types of learning styles too, whether someone prefers to read something, or they prefer to listen to something, or they prefer to observe how something's done. We go through all of those aspects and provide that for everyone so that it's a well-rounded understanding of a process. And I think that's essential when it comes to the care of animals, because if you don't have an understanding of why something is done, then there's no innovation that comes from that either. I think once you have a full picture of why we do things the way we do them, then you're able to positively contribute to better ways of doing things or more efficient ways of doing things. And that's, I think, that progress forward that's so important.
And the thing I think people underestimate about programs like that is not just what you do for the people who come, but what they do for you. In terms of, if you want to stay young, you'll spend time around young people, because you don't get jaded when you spend time around young people. When you get to be my age, there's a lot of jading that has happened, and it's really hard to not become more fixed in the negative. But when you spend time around people who haven't been inculcated to know what they're supposed to think or say about a certain topic, especially in science, it's transformative for the person who is, part of the training. It's just a circle that is really important. It's not just a unidirectional, well, I'm going to tell you what to do and I'm going to tell you what I know. It's that they're going to ask you questions, tell you things they know that'll transform how you think about things. And making your brain work like that keeps people younger.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's essential for us to be able to work across generations, across communities. That collaboration in all aspects of society is so important. And the more you can open up yourself to that, I think the better you are as a human, but also you're given all of these new perspectives and new ways of thinking about things. And yeah, I completely agree. I think that's so important, especially as I age.
Yeah, as you age. Okay.
Well, that's awesome. This has been so great. And Aiyana, is there anything you want to plug or promote otherwise?
No, I don't think so. It's always it's been so cool to talk to you all about these amazing birds that we get to work with and all of the wonderful programs. I think I do just want to give a special shout out to the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance and the amazing work that they're doing with this Burrowing Owl program, and for involving the Living Coast and the team that we have here too.
Well, we hope you have
Awesome.
a really good time in graduate school.
Yeah.
When you go pretty soon. Your program's lucky to have you. It's great.
Yeah. Hopefully I can give you a good little check-in on the status of the Ridgway's rails and what we learned about them.
Yeah,
That'd be
for
great.
sure.
We'd love that.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us again. This is awesome. And yeah, feel free to, if there's anything else you want to talk about at another point, we'd love to have you back on. So thank you.
Cool. All right.
Yeah,
well,
something to keep in mind. So thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'll let you know of any cool bird things that come up.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. If you have a question, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Thanks to everyone who has left a review on the podcast app. We really appreciate the support. We asked for your help and you showed up, so we wanted to say thanks. Okay, love you all and see you all next week.